Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Trump's April job numbers are out, and they are on fire. Hardest hit were mainstream journalists who have been praying for tariffs to put us into recession. Last week, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported April jobs rose by 177,000, blowing out expectations of just 133. This was a big deal since it's the first month of the trade war, which hit globalized stock markets so hard. Most important, all the jobs were private sector. Government jobs were actually down thanks to Doge. So there's a big change from Joe Biden's long 4 years where most job growth was either government adjacent, so social assistance jobs, which the Wall Street Journal calls the welfare industrial complex, or they were literally government workers who are, of course, largely parasites who produce nothing. In fact, under Biden, government-funded jobs accounted for all job growth in some states. So in California, 96.5% of job growth last year was government jobs. In Michigan and Illinois, the welfare industrial complex accounted for 113% of new jobs. In New York, it was 121%. In other words, the real economy actually shrank as government and welfare bloated, not least for the 20 million plus illegals who studies say consume 6 times more in welfare than they pay in taxes. All that is now ending with government jobs actually down since Trump took office, and yet he is still turning in blockbuster jobs numbers. So this is only the beginning. Last week I mentioned the epic investment boom that sent investment numbers up at a 22% annual pace, while driving GDP to near 5% growth after import front-running. 5% is basically Asia level, something we have not seen in decades outside of one-off recession bounce-backs. The boom is driven by both foreign and even domestic companies pouring trillions inside Trump's big, beautiful tariff umbrella to produce stuff here in America. Even at 22% is just 1/5 of the deals Trump has already announced, so there's more coming. Now, for perspective, pre-COVID, the entire economy of 325 million people managed just $4 trillion of investment. Trump has doubled or even tripled that in 3 months. $5 trillion of investment will, of course, drive hundreds of thousands of construction jobs for factories, followed by even more jobs that are permanent manufacturing stuff here in America. Ironically, this could actually raise unemployment rates as millions of Americans who dropped out of the job market under Biden start looking for a job now that they no longer have to compete with minimum wage illegals. Guarantee media will play dumb when the unemployment rate does go up. So what's next? We are going from an economy driven by government spending to an economy driven by building factories. Under Trump, wages are already growing at 3.8%, which is a solid pace. That's before the investment tsunami hits. As those investments play out, as mass deportations and above all self-deportations proceed, wage growth could soar, especially for the young and blue collars. We're already seeing the ducks line up. The Bureau of Labor Statistics just reported that the nationwide employment level is now flipping, with hundreds of thousands of jobs flipping from foreign-born workers to native-born workers. Investment is reindustrializing America much faster than I expected, and combined with deportations, millions of American workers could start the long road to making up the wages they lost under Biden. Elon Musk is stepping back from Doge, even as he promises Doge will become a permanent fixture in Washington, a permanent drain on our ruling swamp. Last week, Elon gave what media billed as a wrap-up of Doge's work at a cabinet meeting, sporting 2 hats, saying he will spend more time on Tesla and, of course, going to Mars. Afterwards, he sat down with Axios for what the Washington Post framed as a, quote, exit interview. It was anything but. In fact, Elon said Doge would be permanent instead of wrapping up on July 4th as originally intended. He called Doge, quote, a way of life like Buddhism, adding, is Buddha needed for Buddhism? Moreover, this is what Elon does. In his companies, Elon is very hands-on setting it up. Then he leaves it to capable people and only parachutes in if there is a major problem to troubleshoot. This is what he does with Tesla, with SpaceX, with X, if you recall the kitchen sink. This is why Elon can run a half dozen major companies worth several hundreds of billions and still find time to go to MMA fights and repopulate the Earth. Having said it, Elon admitted Doge has not been, quote, as effective as I like. Namely, by his count, Doge has found $160 billion in spending when he had hoped for $8 trillion plus. A big part of that, of course, has been resistance from inside government, above all by Congress. Now, I mentioned in recent videos how the Republican Congress is trying to re-spend between 85 cents on the dollar, the House, and 99 cents in the Senate of Doge savings, including on the military, which is grotesquely overfunded, yet has found less than 1% of its budget in Doge savings. If you believe that just 1% of the military budget is waste, I got a bridge to sell you. One congressman recently shared that a proposal to reduce U.S. aid funding, not eliminate, just reduce, actually failed to get a majority of Republicans. That would be the left's biggest slush fund, and most Republicans don't want to cut it. Why? Because the GOP has gotten very comfortable in the corrupt DC swamp, and neither Elon nor Trump can force them. Republican voters have to make the change. Speaking of voters, congressional primaries are coming up in just over 7 months, and since very few people bothered to vote, your vote counts roughly threefold. If you're listening to this video right now, you are precisely the voters who can fix Republicans in Congress. So what's next? Elon is still staying involved. He'll spend a day or two per week on Doge. While making Doge permanent is something we need for transparency to keep voter pressure on Congress. As for Doge itself, like Elon, I was originally hoping for big spending cuts to reduce inflation, along with cutting red tape and regulation to help grow the economy. Now, it's done some of this. Deregulation is going fast, and spending growing 8 times less than Biden at least takes us out of the fire, even if we're still in the frying pan. But the biggest legacy of Doge, and a surprise to me anyway, is the industrial-scale corruption it's found, and which is now out in the sunshine. If that corruption keeps voters engaged enough to light a fire under Congress, we could finally break through. In the coming months, we'll get an actual budget from Congress putting their money where their mouth is, soon followed by those primaries, at which point we will know if Doge has changed Washington for good or if the swamp won this round. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. In the new year, it's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. An IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. With Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans, and it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/Peter. A word from our sponsor. If you own gold or silver, you know they're a great hedge against financial instability and let you grow your wealth outside the banking system and gain greater control over your finances. Monetary Metals offers you the ability to increase your precious metal ounces every single month. Instead of paying to own metal, with Monetary Metals, you get paid 4% on your gold paid in more ounces. Now's the time to secure your wealth and build your legacy in an asset that the government cannot inflate away. Join thousands of investors earning interest in physical gold and silver every month with Monetary Metals. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn more. Now back to our show. There is hope for Britain as the Populist Reform Party just swept local elections, winning more seats than both major parties combined. Will there come a day when British people can joke about identifying as a fish or criticize mass migration and not get arrested? Last week, Britain held nationwide elections for local councils. In U.S. terms, these are somewhere between state legislators and county commissioners. The Populist Reform UK Party trounced both major parties, winning more seats than Labour and Conservatives combined. In fact, those major parties lost 2/3 of all the seats in play. The New York Times was in full panic mode, hyperventilating that populist Nigel Farage may have, quote, blown a hole in Britain's two-party system. The populists ran on freezing all non-essential immigration, ending free housing for so-called asylum seekers, prosecuting illegal immigration, and an extra tax on foreign workers. It's not a terrible idea. They also want a British Doge, tax cuts for small business and blue collars, patriotic education in British schools, and scrapping so-called net zero global warming mandates. Now, for the moment, the major parties are still in charge. Just 1 in 9 local seats were up this election. And thanks to Britain's election system, Reform still only has 5 seats in national parliament out of 650. So we won't be getting that British Doge quite yet. The most of the changes near term is Reform now controls 10 local councils, which run things like education, welfare, housing, licensing, and, quote, community well-being. That's where the migrants come in. Reform will now use those 10 to showcase how they would run the country, especially on benefits to migrants, perhaps even that Victorian curriculum. The much bigger impact is that this is an existential rejection of the British establishment, who voters are overwhelmingly rejecting. In fact, never in British history has an upstart beat both major parties combined. Even during the Brexit surge, the major parties won 7 times more seats than the Populists. To get anything remotely close, you would have to go back to 1924. The context here is British Conservatives misran the country for 14 years, essentially ruling as American Democrats. So mass migration, global warming mandates, COVID, lockdowns, and vax mandates. The Conservatives literally built Britain's diversity police state that is currently arresting people for memes whilst welcoming migrant grooming gangs with open arms and open wallets. That failure lost Conservatives the election last year, delivering it to the Socialist Labour Party, who of course changed none of it and are now sporting a 25% approval rating. So the British hate the Socialists, and they don't trust the Conservatives to do anything different. That leaves the Populists as last man standing despite censorship, misinformation, and non-stop attacks by Britain's establishment on the same script they attacked Trump here in America. So what's next? The next election in Britain is not required until 2029, although it could happen sooner if the ruling party approval stays in the gutter. When it does come, prediction market Kalshi now has Reform as odds-on to win national power. The only way for Britain's establishment to stop this is copy the common-sense policies of Reform, from migration to small business to free speech. What they'll probably do instead is double down on mass migration, social engineering, and the Britain last diversity police state, perhaps praying that censorship and the establishment firewall can protect them, even though it just failed to protect them. The British people have had it with their corrupt political establishment. The clock is now ticking. Donald Trump submitted his budget for next year, slashing nearly a quarter of spending from non-defense programs, but entirely canceling it with increased military spending and border security. The net comes to plus $160 billion in spending. To be fair, it's a big change from Joe Biden, who in his last budget proposed $1.2 trillion in additional spending, 8 times more, of which Congress gave Joe Biden $800 billion. Still, a lot of us were hoping for cuts in spending, and rather big ones. Now, you could argue border security is an investment. Each deported illegal saves us hundreds of thousands down the line, plus the crime. You could even argue the military is fixing the wars Biden let happen. And without a doubt, both are better than sending billions to the radical left slush funds from USAID to the DEI industrial complex. Still, more government spending is not what most Trump voters were hoping for. So this is the so-called skinny budget, which presidents put out to test the waters before issuing a full budget request. And none of this has force of law. It just nudges Congress, who ultimately writes the budget. So why are the cuts so small? Setting aside the border crisis and Trump's affinity for military spending, the main reason is that Trump and Congress have taken so-called entitlement spending off the table. These include Social Security and Medicare, but also Medicaid, which is bloated by illegals and industrial-scale fraud. People claiming to be poor so they both avoid taxes and get free medical care. Now, Doge is trying to cut these by rooting out fraud, but entitlements are the third rail in politics. They're very popular, and anybody who touches them gets electrocuted. So Trump knows there is no way Congress will formally vote for cuts. Now, taking entitlements off the table takes out nearly 2/3 of federal spending. Interest on the debt takes that to 3/4. They're not cutting that. And defense takes it to just shy 90% of the budget off the table. That leaves just $1 trillion in play out of a $7 trillion budget. So Trump's 1/4 cut is exactly what the voters ordered. After all, it includes a 44% cut to housing and urban development, 55% cut to EPA, and an 84% cut to state foreign aid. But zoom out, and it is peanuts. So what's next? It's still possible that cuts could grow between fraud in Social Security and Medicaid and interest on the national debt that's actually falling for the first time in years. On the other hand, it could also get worse as Congress dreams up new ways to waste money. Congress is already trying to respend between 85 and 99 cents on the dollar of Doge savings. In Trump's first term, he proposed massive budget cuts every single year. Congress rejected them, but the flesh was willing. Throw in Elon and Doge, and we've got the best budget-cutting team in decades, maybe since Warren G. Harding. And if the best we get from this dream team is an increase in spending, then truly nothing stops this train. Meaning we need fundamental reform, whether a balanced budget amendment, which will never pass Congress, or ending the Fed to reimpose limits to federal spending. Otherwise, we are headed off the cliff. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. Young Americans are barely keeping their head above water, with just 1 in 6 saying they are financially secure, in case you wonder why they're ready to burn it all down. So says a new poll from the Harvard Kennedy School, which finds that most young people think they will never achieve financial stability. As you'd expect, it's worse for those without a college degree, but even with a degree, almost a third are living paycheck to paycheck. Of course, partly because they're carrying student loans for a degree that, according to a recent study, costs $300,000 on average for a BA. Disturbingly, the poll found it's getting worse as they get older, with those in their late 20s in even worse shape than early 20s. It's not just financial. The poll finds that just 1 in 6 young people report having deep social connections or feeling deeply connected to their community. Now, I mentioned in recent videos how young Americans are the loneliest generation, which is driving depression, obesity, and addiction. This apparently got a lot worse during the COVID lockdowns, with socially isolated young people reporting higher rates of depression, especially those who were in high school or college during the pandemic. According to the Harvard poll, a majority of young people who were socially isolated during the pandemic reported symptoms of depression. This all is influencing their life choices. So young people are not having sex, they're not even dating. Almost half think they will never find a long-term romantic partner, never mind a spouse. The poll found under half of young Americans expect to have kids. Even fewer actually do have kids. In 1990, 60% of Americans in their 30s had kids. Today, it's just 27%. Now, in recent videos, I've mentioned how the percent of young Americans living with their parents is now at 1940s levels. So at age 25, just 1 in 7 boomers lived at home. Now, it's 27% for millennials and 30% for Gen Z. Worse, in 1970, most young adults living at home could afford to move out. Today, it's just 18% who can afford to move out. The other 82% are stuck. In other words, in 1940, they lived at home because they were saving themselves for a good husband. Today, they live at home because rat-infested one-bedrooms cost 60 hours a week packing groceries. What's driving all this, of course, is 50 years of stagnant wages. Since the year 2000 alone, median real incomes for young adults have dropped by 10%, while inflation soared. One study last year from Raj Chetty at Stanford found that for the first time in American history, kids are not doing better than their parents. So for Americans born in 1940, 90% out-earned their parents at their age. By Gen X, that was down to 60%, thank Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter. For millennials, it is now a, quote, coin flip, with half earning less than their parents. In other words, 40 years of stagnation. So what's next? Trump's policies are trying to help the young. Mass deportation boosts wages for blue collars and entry-level jobs, cutting red tape, and small business taxes boosts hiring and entrepreneurship. But so far, big changes are blocked by Congress, who sits on its hands or schmoozes with lobbyists instead of throwing young people a lifeline. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersaintange.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, We'll be watching. See you next time.